All right, ready? Okay. This is so embarrassing.
You did it though.
Oh my God. Oh, I can't just like leave you hanging like that. All right, guys, whatever. Welcome back to another episode of The Least Favored. I kind of want to start saying I'm your host, Natalie. I feel like I should be saying something else.
I thought you said you want to start saying
Stop.
that. Oh, okay.
But I don't know what else I should be saying. Like, I feel like we should be introducing each other and like using interesting words.
This is my host, Natalie.
I thought you were going to say something better.
I'll fuck with you. This is Natalie. She runs the shit here. You know what I'm saying? She gets it popping.
Right, let them know. What else? Keep going. That's it.
A resident party animal, hookah smoker, hookah connoisseur.
Hookah mommy.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes, and we are with Anthony, the mastermind, the technological genius, the, I don't know, sound engineer. Is that what you call that? I don't know what the fuck you call that. Producer?
Yeah,
just a chill, laid-back guy who handles all of my mood swings and major life crises, right? Yes. All right, so this week is a special episode.
Yes.
It's a little bit different than our normal episodes.
Correct.
So I did an interview with a criminal psychologist named Dr. Lina Haji, and she has been working with, psychopaths, serial killers, inmates, working in the prison system for like over 20 years. It was a great conversation. And the reason why I wanted to do this was because I saw the Jeffrey Dahmer doc.
Yes.
And usually, you know me, that's not really my type of thing to watch.
Not your genre.
Not my genre. I'm a rom-com person. And so, but like there was so much buzzing around it. And I was like, you know what? Let me see what the hype is about. And it was actually very interesting. And I kind of just wanted to understand more of like the minds of serial killers or psychopaths, and I wanted someone who can actually be like teach us some things, an expert, not just Googling random shit. So I reached out to her on Instagram, and I'm actually really proud of myself because I don't be approaching people for shit.
No,
I just fucking went for it.
You did a very good job conducting the interview.
Thank you.
Very good questions, and she got some really good information.
Yes,
is dope in here. Like one thing about trauma. And like how people just think everything they go through is like trauma.
So briefly, let me talk about what we spoke about just briefly. So we talk about her experience working with inmates in the prison system. We got the real definition of trauma, because not every little thing that happens to you is traumatic.
So like when I stubbed my toe today, that wasn't traumatic?
That's not traumatic, Anthony. Okay. Cut it out.
Just making sure.
We spoke about trauma bonding, real trauma bonding, and how much responsibility can we place on criminals due to their traumatic past. So she gave me a lot of good information on that. And then we talk about like the characteristics of serial killers, psychopaths, and the difference between being psychotic and psychopathic, because there is a difference. Yes. And then we spoke about her favorite serial killer, Richard Ramirez, who I don't even know who the fuck that was.
I definitely knew this.
And so I hope you guys enjoy it. And
I have a question before we transition to that. I just had a question, right?
Okay, go.
How do you feel about like when the news, like someone like becomes like, I don't want to say someone becomes a serial killer, someone's a killer, and when they try to like humanize them, like how do you feel about that?
Okay, I feel like I know why you're asking me that, because you felt people were saying that about the Jeffrey Dahmer thing.
Well, because also what you just said there too.
What did I say?
Something.
Oh, how much responsibility can you place?
Responsibility can you place?
Yeah.
Because like, what if someone has been abused as a kid growing up,
right?
And then as they get older, they only know abuse,
right?
So that's what they do to someone else,
right?
And it's like, damn, this person had this crazy childhood. Mm-hmm. It's like,
well, you see, so she actually gets into I actually asked her that, and she actually gets into it. So I don't want to like butcher her explanation, but
that's how you feel about it.
Briefly, okay. So what we both concluded and how I really do feel about this is like, we all have a traumatic past. Like all of us have gone through something, but that's still no excuse to be a shitty person or to commit crimes, right? Like that doesn't excuse you, but there are people who really do have a real diagnosis and they can't help it, unfortunately. That's just what it is. So I understand both sides of it, but overall, like, you really gotta like dig deeper, because you can't just say, oh, because of this is why I'm a shitty person, or this is why I killed this many people. Like, no, it has to be valid.
Okay.
So can we get into the interview now?
We can get into the interview
now. All right, let's do a little, I don't even know. Oh my God.
I don't know if that's appropriate.
Awesome. All right. Hi.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. I'm Natalie.
Hi, Natalie.
The guy guy that was talking, he's my co-host and my producer and engineer, all that good stuff.
Okay.
So, okay. So basically my podcast, we talk about mental health, relationships, but then we also like to do a lot of like topics where we're learning with the people who are listening with us. And so obviously, like once I started, the craze of the Jeffrey Dahmer documentary, and I was born in 92, so I wasn't even really like aware of what was going on. But it was just something like, okay, how are people born like this? What's going on? How could you notice the signs? What goes through the mind of a serial killer, a psychopath? And so I looked you up on Instagram, and you are so informative. You have all your videos. I literally watch it every Monday. You come on with the videos and you explain like the misdiagnosis and stuff. And I'm like, wow, like this is so fascinating to me.
Thank you.
And so I just wanted you to like come and just teach me some things.
Yes. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for that amazing feedback. I really appreciate that, because every time I do a video, I feel like I'm just talking to myself. But that's I'm really honored and glad that somebody's listening. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess we could just start like with introductions, your name, where you're from, how long you've been doing what you do.
Okay. Okay, so my name is Dr. Lina Haji. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Florida. I practice mostly forensic psychology as well as clinical psychology. Where am I from? Ethnically, my mom is French. My dad is Indian from East Africa. I was born in Switzerland and raised in New York.
Oh my God. Wait, what part of New York?
I was born in the city. Well, I was raised in the city. I lived in the Bronx. I lived in Queens. I lived in Brooklyn. I lived everywhere. So I grew up on. Are you from New York?
Yeah, I'm from the Bronx, actually.
Oh, yes. I went to Union College.
Oh my God, I went there too.
No way. Yeah. So
I'm a speech therapist.
Oh, perfect. My girlfriend who went to Lehman is a speech therapist. So I did my bachelor's at Lehman. I went a little nuts with school. I did my bachelor's at Lehman. I did my first master's at John Jay. I did my second master's here in Miami, and then I did my doctorate in Miami. But yeah, I was at Lehman. I lived, you know where the McDonald's is on Williamsbridge Road?
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah, so I lived right behind that McDonald's for like 7 years.
Oh my God.
Yes.
I was closer to like Jerome, like Gun Hill, Jerome Avenue area.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's so crazy.
Yeah, if I was a little younger, I bet you we'd know the same people, because I know people who are still on Gun Hill.
Oh yeah. So how long have you been in Miami?
So I moved in Miami in 2009 to do my doctorate. And I stayed here from 2009 to 2015. When you finish a doctorate, you have to do pre-doctoral residency and postdoctoral fellowship. I did that in California for 3 years, and then I moved back to Miami in 2018.
Wow. Would you ever do you miss New York at all?
I miss New York like crazy, because Miami people are not the best, and I'm in New York until I die. Yeah,
I feel the New York in you though.
I feel
the vibe.
Thank you. That's such a compliment. So yeah, like I'm in New York until I die, but and my family and friends are all still in New York. But here's the thing: I hate the cold. Like I hate it. I hate it. I'm one of those people like
freezing now. Like it is so cold. Yeah. I want to move to Miami, but like I'm just like bacon, egg, and cheese on the corner. Like, yeah, you know what I mean? Chopped cheese, like it's just whatever. Okay, so I wanted to get into what are your areas of study specifically? So what do you like mainly focus on, I guess?
So my main area is forensic psychology, but a lot of people don't understand that forensic psychology is also a huge field. I mean, you can work with male offenders, female offenders, juveniles, sex offenders. You can do risk assessments, competency, death penalty cases. You can do treatment. You can do so even forensic psychology is a huge diverse field. So my areas of specialty are competency evaluation. So that's kind of is somebody competent enough to proceed to trial and to go through with the criminal process. I worked in prison for 20 years. I worked in 9 prisons in 4 states. So I was very much into correctional psychology, which is a little different from forensic, because correctional, you're in the facility, you're doing treatment, you're dealing with inmates every day. Whereas forensic is more taking clinical psychology and answering a legal question. So it's an easy transition, if you will, but So I don't do much treatment anymore. I also do a lot of malingering, which is a lot of, that's part of evaluation. So inmates kind of faking mentally ill so that they don't have to face the consequences of their
Oh
actions.
my God, how much do you get of that?
A lot. Because when you're doing competency evaluations, you have to realize that, that's really the starting point for where they're going to, whether they're going to go to prison or whether they're going to go to a psych hospital, whether they're going to have a huge sentence or a non-huge sentence.
Yeah.
So I deal with that all the time. It's my favorite. I love it because it's like a game to me. It's like a puzzle.
Well, I have a question with that though. Like, I guess it's like, I don't even know how I can like explain it, but if someone does commit a crime though, wouldn't that still, even let's say if they're not diagnosed with a mental disorder, is there a way that you can still count that brief moment of like a moment of insanity, but like they don't have a disorder?
So that's a very, very good question. And that comes up a lot in what we call NGRI cases, not guilty by reason of insanity. So being not guilty by reason of insanity is very, very rare. You have to really prove that at the time of the crime, the person was essentially disconnected from reality in a sense that like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Andrea Yates case, but so she drowned all 5 of her children. She killed all 5 of her children.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So she was found not guilty by reason of insanity because she genuinely believed, she had a psychotic thought process. She genuinely believed that killing her 5 children was saving them from the devil. She really believed that. Like this wasn't a BS kind of defense.
How could you prove that she really believed? You know what I mean?
So like, that's where we come in. How do you prove that? Because anybody could say, well, I killed them because I thought that was saving them from the devil. So there's
and if they're a good enough actor or actress.
Correct. But so when you're trained in forensic psychology, and especially in that area, first of all, there's record review, right? That's imperative. You have to check with her family, her doctors, her other treating providers. Was she on meds? Was she ever hospitalized? Are there hospital records? Before this crime even happened, was there like a huge history that she was psychotic? That's number one. Number two, then there's psychological testing, which picks up on faking illness, so to speak. It's not perfect, but it's definitely an objective way to figure out if this person is actually mentally ill. Are they malingering, which is basically being full of crap. So it's a very intensive process, but so anyway, that's how you figure out if they were and insanity is a legal term. It's not a clinical term. Lawyers and the legal system is very black and white. Either you're crazy or you're not crazy. Whereas for us, it's much more gray than that. We're all a little crazy. You know what I mean? And like anybody who commits a murder or something, a really serious offense at the time was probably a little quote unquote crazy. The main difference is, were they disconnected with reality? And here's the key. Did they know the difference between right and wrong? Was there an appreciation of the crime? And so if you kill all your 5 children, but you genuinely believe that you're saving them from the devil, and you continue to believe that, and there's a long history that you believe that, odds are you were actually insane legally at the time of the crime. But you get a lot of malingering for that kind of stuff. So I don't know.
Oh my God. Yeah. No, that was great. No, because I always wondered, I'm like, that was a great explanation, because I always wondered, like, anybody can say, oh, well, I had a moment of, like I lost it. I reached a breaking point, and we all have our breaking point.
Right.
So it's like, but I didn't know it was such an extensive process. That's great. I had no idea. That's a lot.
It's an extremely extensive process.
Yeah, that is a lot.
I mean, the amount of time, energy, and resources that goes into a not guilty by reason of insanity evaluation is huge. It's a lot of work. So it's not just, because you'll have a lot of inmates that'll be like, I evaluated an inmate last week who raped a 13-year-old girl 3 times. And so I was talking to him. He could tell me about his childhood. He could tell me about his schooling. He could tell me about, he had no mental health history. He could tell me every single detail of his life, except when I started asking about the rapes, he was like, I don't remember. I blacked out. I don't remember. I blacked out. So there's a few things. So that's already red flag number 1, right? The fact that you remember everything else about your life, but you don't remember this one moment, that's not really how the brain works. Number two, he had no history of mental illness. I reviewed records for about 2 hours and there was no indication. Number three, you know, that's really not how the brain works. You know, you don't just kind of black out. Yes, you can go into a crazy rage, or yes, you can, you know, kind of disassociate, or so again, it's extensive and you really have to be thorough. But the bottom line is he was full of it. There's no way you remember everything except when you raped a 13-year-old girl 13 times.
Yeah.
And he knew enough to hide it. He knew enough to lie about it. He knew there was very calculated, premeditated, you know, that shows that your thought process is intact. You told her to lie, you gave her alcohol, like you knew what you were doing, you know? So there are ways for forensic psychologists to figure all that stuff out.
And I saw that on your page, you used to treat victims, right?
I
but
did.
Then you switched. Oh, you still do?
Well, so it's not that I switched. I've generally always worked with offenders. The thing is, a lot of offenders are also victims. They also have a history of trauma. So even if you're treating offenders, you can also be treating, you know, they're not mutually exclusive. You're going to be a offender and a victim, you know? So there's that. And also, so I did a little bit of treating victims when I was in training. The reason I switched is because it's actually the reason I switched is because I found treating victims to be much more difficult, in the sense that, like, you really tend to take that stuff home with you, especially when it's children. You think about it a lot. It's hard to shut off. God bless psychologists who work and therapists that work with victims of abuse, because it's very difficult. For me, this might sound a little cold, but at least I know my limits. To work with offenders, it's easy to shut off and just kind of go about your day. For me, working with the victims was very hard and very consuming, so it just wasn't my preference. That's it.
Yeah. No, yeah, that makes sense. I also, okay. So now we're going to get into like some terms.
Okay.
And defining some terms, because there's a lot of things that we all use. Like now, trauma is a big deal, right? Okay, and we're all traumatized from things, right? But I really wanted you to first just explain like the true meaning of what trauma is and what are like the real symptoms associated with it.
Okay, so yes, trauma is a very trendy vogue term, and everybody has trauma, and everybody has, and I immediately say to that, like, no, we all have had difficult moments in our life. We all have had things that have negatively affected us. We all have things that have, you know, impacted us. That's part of life. That's everybody. But does everybody have trauma? No. Trauma is really either experiencing or witnessing an adverse effect that absolutely impacted you to the point where you ended up having psychiatric symptoms. So and two people can experience or witness the same event and have completely different outcomes, right? Look at war veterans, for example. Two soldiers could go to the same war and one can come back fine and one can come back with extreme PTSD. So there's a lot of factors that goes into that. So when you're talking about how trauma can negatively affect someone, what you're really talking about is a trauma disorder. And for the sake of discussion, we'll talk about PTSD. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is when you develop, again, psychiatric symptoms in response to a traumatic event. And those symptoms include things like flashbacks, you know, intrusive thoughts, having the thoughts about the trauma coming in all the time, nightmares, hypervigilance. So that's like being on your toes all the time. You know, you see this a lot in war veterans. They're always kind of on their toes because they've been conditioned that way. Paranoia, same thing. You know, you have to sit a certain place in a restaurant because you're scared. Maybe if you're a victim of a crime, that somebody's going to come after you. Poor sleep, poor mood, depression, anxiety. So in order to get a diagnosis of PTSD, it's not enough to just have a history of trauma. You have to then have developed these psychiatric symptoms as a response. And again, some people have histories of trauma and they end up being quote unquote fine. And some people have histories of trauma and they end up developing PTSD. So trauma is an adverse event that has negatively affected you. But the problem I see in these days is because it's such a trendy term, people just say like, oh, my ex broke my heart and that's traumatic. And it's like, well, that's not, it's not that I'm trying to diminish how difficult that is or how hard that can be, but it's not necessarily trauma, because that term has become so diluted and overused. You know, it's kind of taking away from the true victims of trauma, rape victims and assault victims, and people who had been through attempted murder or things like a hurricane or an earthquake, or have lost everything, or war. You know, I can go on and on about traumatic events, car accidents. There can be so many different kinds of traumatic events. I think the problem is people tend to be so quick to be like, well, it's my trauma, or I'm traumatized. And that's not really always accurate.
Yeah. I do want to say real quick, if it shuts off, just click the link again, okay?
Okay.
It's like a 30-minute, but because we have a lot more and I don't want to.
I got you.
Okay, so boom. Another term that's super popular now, especially in the relationship world, when you get into like a toxic relationship, is like trauma bonding. Like, oh, I can't let him go because we have a trauma bond. And it's like, what? So again, what is a trauma? That's a real definition of trauma bond.
Okay. Actually, I made a video on this like 2 weeks ago. So trauma bonding, first of all, that's a term. That's not a term I ever heard in graduate school. It's not a term that most of my colleagues heard in graduate school. It's a pretty relatively new term. So I looked up some definitions of it because I was like, what is this trauma bonding everybody's talking about? Like, this doesn't make sense. So trauma bonding really has to do with a victim who identifies with their abuser. So typically it's somebody who, let's say a woman is in a domestic violence relationship and she's constantly being physically abused, emotionally abused, and yet there's that cycle of abuse, right? The abuser will be really nice, and then they will, you know, abuse them, and then they will say they're sorry, and maybe I'll never do it again. And there's a cooling period, and then it happens again, and cycle and cycle and cycle. So what happens is the victim ends up being attached to that kind of how would you say relation,
like a push-pull?
Like a push-pull.
Yeah.
The relational cycle is the way that they are attached to this human being, because what happens in domestic violence relationship is it's called intermittent reinforcement, right? So the flowers and the I'm sorry and the I'll never do it again, that becomes something that reinforces the abuser to stay in the relationship over and over and over again. So that's really what trauma bonding is. What I find is that people think that trauma bonding has to do with, oh, I have a crappy situation, you have a crappy situation, and we're bonding. Or we both have an addiction, we're bonding. Or we both have mental health issues, we're bonding. That's not what trauma bonding is. Trauma bonding really has to do with an abusive relationship. And it can be emotionally abusive. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be physically, sexually abusive. It can be emotionally abusive.
Okay, awesome. See, perfect. Thank you. We needed that, because not every toxic relationship is a trauma bond. Like, leave him. Just leave him.
Let me listen. And I'm not just talking about patients or things I see on social media. I'm talking about like friends who are like, I'm trauma bonded. I'm like, no, that's not what that is. You're just settling. That's what that is. You're just settling for a shitty relationship because you're too scared to be alone and you don't want to leave, or whatever the case may be. And no judgment, but that's not what trauma bonding is. No.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so now sticking with that a little bit, but moving on, like, how much then, with all of that, right, how much responsibility can we actually place on a criminal when it comes to trauma? Like, how traumatized do they need to be, or like how I guess, like, how severe does the crime need to be for you to be like, all right, it was because of his traumatic past? Or
so that's a very interesting question. And again, it's very complicated, right? Because for people to say, well, I was traumatized, or I had a traumatic childhood, or I have PTSD, and so I committed this crime. It's never that clear. It's never that black and white, because if that were the case, that means all people who have a history of trauma would end up being criminals. And the research and the statistics shows that most people who are victims of trauma do not go on to become criminals. That's not what the statistics say. I know plenty of women and men who have sexual abuse histories, who have been to war, who have been in car accidents, who have had real trauma happen to them, and they didn't go on to become murderers and serial killers or rapists or drug dealers. So that's the first thing I want to say about that. It's not such it's very rare for it to be very linear. You know, this horrible trauma happened to me, my childhood was awful, and so now I engage in criminal activities. It's not that black and white. However, you don't want to be dismissive of a trauma history. You know, I've had inmates I've worked with who had extreme trauma histories where they were severely beaten as children or severely neglected, or they had sexual abuse, really horrendous traumatic childhoods. And so in a way, you have to take that into account because it has shape their behavior. Trauma changes the brain literally. So again, they might have symptoms of PTSD. They're more paranoid. They're more hypervigilant. They're more defensive. They're more like, I'm not going to let the world hurt me because I've been so hurt. So you kind of understand that they become violent or aggressive. However, it's very hard to again say, well, you have a trauma history and so you engaged in this traumatic behavior, because at the end of the day, you still have a choice, right? You still have to be accountable for your actions. I know people with horrific childhoods who did not go on to become criminals. But again, you don't want to dismiss that when you're conceptualizing an inmate, because of course it plays a role. Of course, if you had a horrible childhood, or you were abused, or you're a female offender and you were a prostitute and you were raped repeatedly, and so you ended up being violent. I mean, all of that stuff plays a role. So I really can't give like a black and white cut and dry answer. But I think it needs to be individualized. You need to look at every person as an individual and what's your trauma history and how did you end up committing these crimes and what led to that. It needs to be very individualized. I hope that makes sense.
No, yeah, that makes total sense. Absolutely. I laugh because you were like, you still have to be accountable for your actions. Yeah. And it's just funny because like literally for the past month, every episode we've recorded, accountability comes up in every episode. And that's become the word of our podcast. So I'm just like, wow, another episode and it comes up again.
Well, because I think people are letting go of that. You know, they're thinking, poor me, I had it bad so I can do whatever I want. Well, I had some horrible things happen to me. You might have had some horrible things happen. A lot of people might have had some horrible things happen to them. That doesn't mean that, you know, you can go on and do whatever you want in the world. It's not how it works, you know, unfortunately.
Right. Even if it's not a crime, you still don't have to be a shitty person, just in general.
Right. It doesn't excuse your behavior. That's not how it works.
Right. Exactly. All right. So now I want to get into some, I guess, popular or the most common characteristics of a serial killer.
Okay. So a serial killer is somebody who commits, I believe the FBI defines it. It's really not a clinical term. It's actually a law enforcement term, but I think the FBI defines it as somebody who engages in 2 or more homicides. And there's a certain period of time. I'm not exactly familiar what that is. So this is somebody who commits a murder, and then there's a period of cooling off, and then they commit another murder, and then they commit another murder, and they commit another murder. So
wait, real quick, would you consider then, if it's not like a clinical term, right? Would they be under just like psychopaths?
Probably. So it's assumed that all serial killers are psychopaths, right? However, that's not necessarily true. So I would say probably most serial killers are psychopaths. But interestingly enough, not all psychopaths are serial
killers. Got it. Okay.
Right. So psychopath is is a clinical term. It's psychopathy is a construct. It's a combination of personality clusters that makes up somebody in order for them to be a psychopath. Whereas a serial killer is somebody who goes on committing more than one murder, murder after murder after murder after murder. So by default, most serial killers are going to be psychopaths unless there's something else going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then what's the difference between being psychotic versus psychopathic?
Great question. People mix that up all the time. So psychosis, psychotic really has to do with psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. So psychosis it has nothing to do with being a psychopath. They're very different. Psychosis has to do with truly seriously mentally ill people who hear voices that aren't really there. They see things that aren't really there. They usually have a disorganized thought process. They're usually, the ones, unfortunately, you see a lot of them homeless. They're kind of talking to themselves and they're kind of in their own world. They usually have what we call a flat affect. They don't have much emotion because they have a lot of internal preoccupation. So that's people who deal with delusions and hallucinations. So they hear voices that aren't there, or they might see things that aren't there. They believe, they're delusional in the sense that they might think, I don't know, an alien is in their brain, kind of beliefs that are not based in reality. They also usually have, like I said, disorganized thinking. They usually have what we call negative symptoms of flat affect. So people with psychosis are usually seriously mentally ill. They're people with schizophrenia. They're disconnected from reality. And the course of treatment for psychosis or any other psychotic disorder, bipolar with psychotic features, schizoaffective disorder, is antipsychotic medications.
Okay.
Psychopath is completely different. Psychopaths typically are individuals who have lack of remorse. They have no empathy. They usually engage in criminal activity. They are pathological liars. They are people who just really don't have, the easiest way to put it is kind of a conscience. So your Jeffrey Dahmers, your Ted Bundy, so they're not mentally ill. They have a cluster of symptoms that allows them to be somebody who just really has no empathy and no remorse. They usually are not very responsible people. They're usually impulsive. Some of the other factors are substance abuse, pathological lying, criminal engaging different criminal activities. So that's a psychopath. It's very different from somebody who's schizophrenic, who's actually mentally ill.
So now in studying psychopaths, is there like a gene that makes someone a psychopath?
And you have such good questions. So there's not a gene per se, but a lot of the research has shown that there is a lot of what we call predispositions. And there's a lot of neuropsychological research or neurological research showing that the brains of psychopaths are very different. So what the current research says when it comes to, are some people just born evil and are they born psychopaths? That's a very good question. And there's some research to show that with some people, yes, that's kind of what happens. But most of the research is a biopsychosocial approach. So they might be born with this predisposition for psychopathy, and then it's up to the environment to kind of shape that. And so if you're born with a predisposition for psychopathy, but you have very nurturing parents and you have very a healthy household and good nutrition and, you have good modeled behavior and you get an education and you're not impoverished and you have a very good upbringing, chances are you won't turn into a full-blown psychopath. You might have maybe less empathy and not so much remorse, but if you're guided into like a pro-social way of life, maybe you'll end up being a CEO. They say CEOs, that's the other thing. There's a lot of research now on white collar psychopaths. So not necessarily your Jeffrey Dahmers and your Ted Bundys, but maybe your politicians. Somebody comes to mind. Seriously. Yes. Or, a CEO like a Jeff Bezos. I'm not saying Jeff Bezos is a psychopath, but like a Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. Yeah. So you get the gist. So that person might end up, having the person who's born with a predisposition to psychopathy, but ends up having a nurturing, healthy childhood, healthy relationships might end up in a, more prestigious kind of like a Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein, perfect example of a psychopath who never ever went to jail, but he was probably a psychopath.
Okay, wait, hold on.
Yeah. Yes.
Explain his story a little bit because I don't even know who that is.
Oh, okay. So Jeffrey Epstein, he was the guy that committed suicide at Rikers Island. He was he was a sex offender who was in the high society. He hung out with Trump and the Clintons, and apparently he had a sex trafficking ring, and he provided underage girls to very prominent people, rich politicians and rich businessmen all over the world. He was kind of the R. Kelly of the upper echelon, if you will.
Oh my God.
Okay, so he never went to jail and he probably never murdered anyone, but odds are he was a psychopath. And yet, you know, when we think psychopath, we think Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer,
Right.
Night Stalker. So that's not necessarily true. So going back, if you have somebody who's born with a predisposition for psychopathy and they are put in a non-nurturing household with a lot of trauma and abuse, and maybe they don't have good nutrition and they don't have good education, then they are more likely to go end up being, you know, a very dangerous criminal. So it's complicated. It's a lot more complicated than, you know, a 2-hour Netflix special makes it out to
right.
be. You know,
exactly. And I'm like, there's so many, even when you watch those things, yes, you're gaining some information and a little bit of insight, but there's still so many questions that come up that I'm not going to learn from a documentary.
Yeah,
like, I'm just going to learn a certain person's story and what they went through, but that's not a one size fits all for everyone.
Right, exactly.
And so I think the problem is that we see just one documentary or maybe like 4 or 5, whatever. And it's just like, people just run with it, whatever information that, oh, now all psychopaths are like this and all serial killers are like that. And it's like, no.
And you're always watching the documentary, like, where did it go wrong? Like, what were the
yes.
And we have to remember that documentaries are always shot from one perspective and they're meant to last in 1 hour to 2 hours. So of course there's a bunch of information that we're missing.
Right. Oh my God, this is so fun. Okay, are you okay? Are you good?
Yes,
do you need a break?
Yes, I'm very flexible. Do whatever you need to do.
Okay, awesome. No, I want to, you know, just make sure. I want to respect your time. Okay, so, perfect. So you were saying about like psychopaths, a flat affect, right, can come, and they have like a lot of the regular, I guess, emotions that like human beings would just have towards each other. So I guess I wanted to know, then would they be like considered like we always say antisocial?
Yes.
Right.
But
there's also something called asocial.
Yes.
And so growing up, I remember, you know, I wasn't the most friendly person. My mother would be like, oh my God, you're so antisocial. Why are you? And I'm like, but then I saw a video and you explained the difference. So let's get into that. What is the difference between being antisocial and being asocial?
Yes. And I'm with you, right? Because everybody in layman's world, everybody uses antisocial as somebody who doesn't want to hang around people or doesn't want to leave the house, you know, and you know, that's just the term for how we use it in regular everyday talk. But in clinical lingo, antisocial actually means somebody who doesn't respect societal norms. So it's a fancy way of saying basically a criminal. So if you're antisocial, it's actually more an appropriate term because it means you're anti-social norms. So you like to break the law, you like to lie, you like to cheat, you like to steal, you like to do all sorts of, you know, not good things. Whereas asocial is really how we talk about antisocial. Asocial is more, I don't feel like hanging out with people. I don't want to leave my house. People annoy me. I'm asocial. So that's actually the difference between antisocial and asocial in the clinical world. But I get that in the non-clinical world, people use antisocial all the time.
Right. So, okay. So, but can a psychopath, I mean, obviously they could be, and you could be antisocial and asocial.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
For sure.
So they're not like completely exclusive from each other.
Correct.
Got it. All right. So then also I saw an interview that you did with someone else. I don't remember her name, but she had a tattoo. She was really pretty.
Oh, she's awesome.
I literally saw the whole thing last night. It was amazing.
Thank you.
So you guys mentioned something because there was a lot of jargon that you guys used. And I was like, what are they talking about? But like you were in your zone. Like you were in your zone.
Yes.
What are cluster B disorders?
Very good question. So cluster B disorders, and look at me, I'm such a dork. I have my DSM.
I love it. Yes.
Okay, so I actually will get right to the source. So personality disorders are different from psychiatric disorders, right?
Okay.
Personality disorders is like it's like an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that's really ingrained in your character, right? So it's not like bipolar or depression or anxiety or schizophrenia where there's like a more of a neurological component. Personality disorder really is what it sounds like. It's part of your personality. It's your character. And it's a lot kind of harder to treat And so we have cluster A personality disorders, cluster B personality disorders, and cluster C personality disorders. So that's just how they like, break them down. So cluster B personality disorders they consist of antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and histrionic personality disorder. So cluster B personality disorders are really known as the kind of how do I say this without sounding like I'm talking down about personality disorders. Cluster B personality are really the more dramatic, emotional, kind of unpredictable personality disorder.
Got it.
So yes, it's antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. So
I was just going to say, where does narcissism fall there? Narcissistic, that's another popular term now.
Yes.
Everyone's a narcissist.
Yes. Those are your cluster B personality disorders. So again, they're very dramatic. They're very over emotional, very unpredictable. That's the cluster B personality disorder.
Okay. So I would say, like, is it possible for you? I mean, do you treat all of those, or do you say, no, I'm just going to focus on this cluster or that cluster? Like,
so I haven't engaged in treatment in a very long time, but I did treatment for 20 years. I think most therapists kind of specialize with certain personality disorders, but as a general rule, most therapists and psychologists are pretty trained in all of the personality disorders.
Got it.
Some people specialize in just narcissistic personality disorder. Right. There are a couple of psychologists on IG who put out wonderful content. Some people are just more focused on borderline personality disorder, which has specialized treatment because it's pretty hard to treat. So it depends on the clinician. It depends on the practitioner.
Okay. I was going to say, what's your favorite, I guess, diagnosis?
So my favorite diagnosis is schizophrenia, because to me, people who struggle with schizophrenia, they're considered seriously mentally ill. And usually when you see them, they're kind of disconnected with reality. They're talking to themselves. If they're not medicated, they're talking to themselves. You can tell that they're hearing voices. They say things that really don't make sense. And a lot of times, they're just kind of lost in the world. And so I love working with schizophrenic patients, because when you see them going from completely psychotic to just kind of like out there, it's usually they're homeless or, they're living in, usually they're homeless if they don't have family for it. And when you get them medicated and you get them into treatment and they start to become better, it's like the best feeling in the world. Like, I know that sounds super corny, but it's like,
I love that.
I remember I worked with one schizophrenic patient. He was an inmate in a California prison, and he used to hear a lot of voices, and he was very paranoid. So for example, he would go to his cell and watch TV, and he used to think that the TV was talking to him because he was psychotic. And so he used to come back to me and say, Dr. Haji, like, I just feel like the TV is always talking to me. So anytime there was a commercial, he would think that commercial was targeting him. He was very paranoid and he was very psychotic, but he was able to understand that he was psychotic because he had been for a while. So I remember we started working on coping skills where I would tell him, Mr. So-and-so, when you think the TV is talking to you, or the commercial about, the Hershey bar or the auto insurance commercial, try and challenge your thoughts and say, well, maybe they're not talking to me. Maybe this is a commercial for everyone who's watching TV. And so we started working on little coping skills like that. And I remember after 2-3 months of treatment, he came running into group, because I ran a group for psychotic patients. And he said, Dr. Haji, last night I was watching TV and I thought the TV was talking to me, and I started to get really anxious and I started to get really scared. And then I remembered to tell myself, it's not just me. This is a commercial for everyone. And I started to realize that I was just hearing voices, and like, he started to get better. And I was like, oh my God, And so people think, oh, they're schizophrenic, like they're sick and they're never going to function properly. But that's not true. You can really, schizophrenia can, with medication and treatment, some of them can lead normal lives. So those are my favorite. That's my favorite.
Would you say with schizophrenia that, I guess bringing it more like how you did on a more conscious level and having them like talk it out instead of kind of sitting in that helps?
Yes. But I mean, honestly, the first line of treatment is medication, because if they're really psychotic and they're not even able to attend.
And what kind of medication is it?
So they're usually called antipsychotics. There's Haldol, there's Risperdal,
Okay.
there's Thorazine. There's a lot of many different kinds of antipsychotic medication. So psychiatry is really needed with psychotic patients, because if they're like this and talking to themselves and just kind of not even present, like you can't really get to them. So they have to be usually medicated first to get kind of stable, and then you can start the therapy.
So the medication does what, more or less, like just sedate them a little bit?
Well, yes, unfortunately, a lot of it is sedated, but you don't want to sedate them so much that they're like, not able to participate.
But just a little more relaxed.
A little more relaxed, what it does is it diminishes the voices. Antipsychotic medications are amazing. Some schizophrenic people get on antipsychotics and the psychotic symptoms go away completely. Some of them, it just diminishes the voices, or it helps them to think more clearly. So they're able to, like this guy, like the guy that I'm talking about, he was on a lot of antipsychotic medications. He needed them just in order to be able to get to the point where he's like, Dr. Haji, I was hearing voices, but I realized that they were just voices. Like in order for him to process the therapy and get to the place where he realizes he's psychotic, he needed those medications. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's my favorite diagnosis.
No, it's funny because I was reading an article about it, and there was this girl that so there's actually like a YouTube community for people who have schizophrenia. Like they put their stories out there. They even, I don't know what it's called when they go from like one person to the other. There's like a word, but I don't know.
Well, they used to call it multiple personality disorder, or they dissociate, or they psychotic episode. Yeah.
So like one of the girls, I went on YouTube and I looked up her video, and she's Daniel, she's somebody else. Like oh wait, you're talking about schizophrenia.
Yeah, you're thinking you're thinking multiple personality disorder. Yeah.
That's the one that I find really fascinating. That one was cool. So I wanted to know, you worked in a prison and you had shared a story about how there was like a riot in your prison. I want you to tell that story. I thought the message behind it was really, really good.
I agree. So I was very young. I was 23. I only had a bachelor's degree. It was a minimum security prison in New Jersey. And I remember one day I was just, my office happened to be in the middle of the pods. Like, so literally I was surrounded by inmate cells, and then my office was in the middle. I don't know what architect thought that was a good idea, but anyway, you'd be surprised. Offices in prison are crazy, but so this one was in the middle of the pod. And so I would be surrounded by inmates all the time. And I remember one day I heard some kind of ruckus, something was going on. I didn't know. And a bunch of inmates came running to me and they said, I didn't have my doctorate yet. I said, Miss Haji, get in your office and lock the door. And I was like, what the hell is going on? They were like, just listen to us, get in your office and lock the door. So I was like, okay. So I got in my office, locked the door. And what ended up happening was there was a riot, like a full-blown prison riot. It was the Latin Kings and the Bloods that were going at it. They were fighting, they were shanking. It was a mess. And a bunch of inmates surrounded my office to protect me from the violence getting to me and getting into my office. And I love that story. And I share that story because, like you said, it highlights these stereotypes that inmates are horrible, bad human beings. At the end of the day, if you treat inmates with respect, you always have, your couple of a-holes and your psychopaths.
Of course. That's everywhere.
Yeah, that's everywhere. Exactly. You have some inmates that really just don't give a F and they're just going to do whatever they're going to do. But I would say that 90 to 95% of inmates are people who just went down the wrong path in life. And if you treat them with respect, they will treat you with respect. They will be fiercely loyal, especially back then. It's changed a little bit now, but there's a whole code of ethics and prison rules. You don't mess. They kind of view you as a sister, a mother, a wife, a girlfriend. And so I was there to help them. I was considered the helper. I was the counselor. So they're going to be fiercely loyal and fiercely defend the person who's helping them. And I shared that story on my IG because I think people just think, oh, people in prison are bad humans. Just lock them up and throw away the key and there's no redemption and F them. And it's like, no, that's not how this works. You have to individualize inmates just the way you individualize people in the community,
Yeah. I actually love that because even it's easy for them, I guess, to trust you because they get vulnerable with you and you don't share their secrets, you keep it quiet. But just how you even trusted them. Like when they said, go into your office, lock yourself, you were like, all right, I'm going to trust my boy.
Yes.
Instead of being like, no, I'm not going to my office. What are you talking about? I'm going to talk to the guards or something. You know what I mean? Like, you also trusted them.
Absolutely. It's a two-way street because I didn't think they were telling me go in the office so we can rape and murder you. I mean, I knew something was going on, but they came to me with a sense of urgency. And I thought, it's a two-way street. You never trust anybody, especially in prison, 100%. You would be a fool to do that just because it's prison. But it was a great, and I have more stories. I have stories of inmates who have given CPR to correction officers when they saw they were having a heart attack, saved them. Yeah, you don't hear about those stories on the news. You only hear about the bad stuff because it's clickbait and you get more viewers. But
and they're in jail. They're animals. They're
they don't
degenerate.
They don't count. They're not human beings. And it's like, no, I've heard and seen inmates give CPR to correction officers having heart attacks. I've heard inmates save other inmates from committing suicide. I saw a story the other day where they caught their cellie hanging from a noose and they cut him down. And saved his life. I mean, there's stories like that all the time, but again, we don't hear that part in the media,
That's amazing. That should be a show. There should be a show like highlighting that.
Yes.
No, but instead we got Orange is the New Black.
Yes. Yeah. Oh my God.
Dying. That would actually be awesome. Look into it. You can probably direct it.
I should. I mean, that stuff
lit.
happens all the time.
Yeah, no, that's amazing to highlight. I wanted to know, I guess, who was your favorite patient, I guess, without violating HIPAA, of course, keeping it as generous as possible. Like, who really stands out to you?
So I have a couple. I have the one I just discussed, the schizophrenic, who started to get a lot of insight and he started to get better and he started to understand his psychosis. And then I have another one who I worked with actually at Sing Sing in New York, in Ossining. So I was at Sing Sing for a couple of years, and there was this one patient, and he was, not that this is something you should look at as a clinician, but he was a very good-looking guy. He was a high-ranking gang member. I think it was, I don't even remember what gang, but he was a very high-ranking gang member, and he was, a pretty buff, good-looking guy who was in for some pretty serious crimes. He had what's called major depressive disorder with psychotic features. So it's not exactly schizophrenia where you're disconnected from reality all the time. But what happens is when these individuals get very, very depressed, then they get psychotic symptoms. So they'll start to hear voices or they'll start to see things. They'll have psychotic symptoms. And he had major depressive disorder with psychotic features. However, since he was a high-ranking gang member, coming to mental health was a huge no-no. Those used to be the gang rules because it was considered a weakness. You don't go to mental health. So if you go to mental health, you can be kicked out of your gang, which is a huge deal in prison. You can't take meds because that's looked down upon, especially back then. This was in 2007 or something. So he didn't care. He was willing to fight for his mental health. And so he would sneak to mental health to get therapy, to get treatment, to get his meds. And that was very dangerous for him to do that. He was taking a big risk because he could have been beat up or, jumped or kicked out of his gang, whatever. And he did that consistently for, I would say, 1 to 2 years. And, you don't get a lot of thank yous in prison because once you're gone or they're gone, there is not supposed to be any contact. But about 2-3 years later, I got a letter from him. He didn't sign it, but I knew it was him. And he talked about he had been released from prison. And he talked about he had also struggled with addiction. So he talked about that he was sober, that he was stable, that he got a job, that he regained custody of his son, and that he was off probation, and that he wanted to thank me for helping him through his time in prison. I know, oh my God, I know.
Oh my God.
So it's one of those feel good because you don't know what happens to inmates unless you hear about them on the news or you see that they come back. You really just don't get to know what happens. And so when he wrote this letter saying I'm employed, I'm sober, I'm taking my meds, I'm stable, I have a job, and I have custody of my son, and I've finished probation successfully, I was like, that one letter kept me going for 10 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you can help one person just get out of that horrible gang life, get out of prison, get their mental health on track, get sober from addiction, and have them live a good, happy, healthy life, it makes all the craziness worthwhile.
You saved a life.
I don't know about that. He chose, you know what? He chose to save his own life. I'll say that.
Yeah, but you helped. You were there. Sometimes people just need the tools. They don't know what else to do, and you provided the tools. So that's huge.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, claps for you. No, for real. That. This is amazing. I'm loving this. I'm nerding out right now.
Yeah.
Okay, a few more questions and then we're done.
Yes.
I wanted to know, all right, so we do a lot of like gender conversations on the podcast, like women and men, blah, blah. So I wanted to know, what is the difference between the motives behind women serial killers and or maybe like psychopaths, let's just say, like, what are the motives? Are they different for women than for men?
That's a really good question. I'm actually not that well versed in that area, only because I only worked with female offenders for like a year, but I'm sure there are different motives. I don't know if you ever watched Monster with Charlize Theron. She played Eileen Wuornos, a famous serial killer. So Eileen Wuornos was a famous serial killer. I think she was executed in the state of Florida. She was a prostitute. And she had a pretty traumatic history, but she murdered like a bunch of Johns, guys that get that, pay for prostitutes.
Yeah.
She murdered a bunch of Johns. So in a lot of people's books, she was kind of, a hero. Like, these guys are paying for sex, and a lot of them are abusing these women and cheating on their wives. And so she just went on a rampage. I know we shouldn't be laughing, but I can't help it. So she killed a bunch of these guys. It turns out that she was like a female psychopath. Like, she had no remorse, no empathy. She was a drug user. I mean, she had all the characteristics of a psychopath. So, but I always found her case interesting because in her case, there was kind of a clear-cut motive. She was, and you should watch that movie. It's called Monster. Charlize Theron.
Let me write it.
Yeah, Charlize Theron plays, and I can email it to you. She plays Eileen Wuornos. She did a great job, by the way. And so you almost had this idea, kind of like, I mean, you're way younger than me, but kind of like Scarface, where you root for the bad guy. You're almost like rooting for her because you're like, these poor women who are selling their bodies, and they're, they have addictions, and they're homeless, and they have no family, and they have nothing, and they're getting abused and abused and abused. And she's going out there and she's kind of being like a vigilante, if you will. And
no, of course not.
I get it. Murder is okay. You get it, but you're
of course.
Attack me. Oh, you're saying murder is okay.
Oh, whatever.
No, but there was a very clear-cut motive. Whereas I find that motives for male serial killers are a little bit more all over the place. But usually motives are rage and control and power. So yeah, I kind of digress. I don't know if the motive, a female psychopath and a male psychopath will typically have the same characteristics, those same traits that I talked about. So I don't know that the motives are that different, although women psychopaths and women serial killers are much less frequent than male psychopaths and male.
That makes sense. Yeah,
but they do exist.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, but I used to like binge watch Snapped when I was younger.
Oh yeah. Snapped is awesome.
So that was like amazing. So it's like, that's why I wanted to ask that question. Okay. Two more. Do you believe that we all have some type of like diagnosis? Like, we're all a little bit of something. You know what I mean?
I don't think we all have some diagnosis. I've evaluated many people who just don't have a diagnosis and they live happy, healthy, fruitful lives. But you have to remember that the DSM-5, which is kind of like, the Bible for mental health practitioners, it's kind of like the book of people who have something wrong with them, like a disorder. So it's kind of like going to the medical doctor and saying, well, everybody has something wrong with them. Well, no, some people have no allergies, no cancer, no high blood pressure, no diabetes. Some people are just very, very healthy. So and they just don't have any issues. They don't take any meds. I think it's the same with psychological or psychiatric disorders, where some people are, pretty generally mentally healthy. I think what's different with mental health, which is kind of similar to physical health, is that, life ebbs and flows. And so sometimes people will experience sadness or anxiety, or they might have grief, or they might have, but does that mean that they meet criteria for an actual diagnosis? Not necessarily, but I do think everybody, everybody's life is so different, and everybody has experienced different things and have different childhoods and different ways that they process things and different ways of acting and thinking. So we're all a little bit different. Maybe there are times in our life where we might meet criteria for a diagnosis, like a grief diagnosis or an anxiety diagnosis. But as a general rule, do I think everybody has some sort of diagnosis? No, I think everybody has some sort of psychological traits or issues. Diagnosis is really, really up there.
Yeah. Okay, last question.
Yes.
Who is your favorite serial killer?
So my favorite serial killer is actually the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. Are you familiar with him? Oh, pull him up on Google if you can. So first of all, he was a pretty so they called him the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. So he's that guy that there's always a famous picture of him with a pentagon on his hand.
Yes, I see it.
Okay, so the reason he was so interesting to me, and let me say that it's not because I'm like a fan, it's because I think he's clinically fascinating. Yeah. So most serial killers, they have like a type. Like if you look at Ted Bundy's victims, they were all brown-haired girls, like in their 20s. They had their hair parted in the middle. Like he had a very specific type. Jeffrey Dahmer, he preyed upon, underprivileged, Black and brown, typically ethnic, young gay males. So the interesting thing about Richard Ramirez is he had like no type. And that's why it was really hard for a law enforcement to find him. I mean, he killed old women, he killed children, he killed women, he killed men, he killed with like suffocation, stabbing. He had all sorts of different kind of MOs for killing. Sometimes he raped and engaged in sexual abuse, and sometimes he didn't. So he was like all over the place.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So from a clinical perspective, I find that really fascinating because it's like, no wonder they never caught him. Like he was just, usually serial killers have a type and they have a way that they engage in the murder. Either they tie people up or they stab them or they shoot them. He was like all over the place with it. Actually, there's a Netflix documentary on him you should watch. It's really interesting.
I will.
I can send you all this stuff on email.
Please.
Yeah. So he is my favorite because they really just could not figure out what his deal was. And so I would have loved to like do psychological assessments on him and figure out like, bro, what is going on? You know what I mean?
Yeah, like what's happening here?
Yeah, what's your deal? Like what drives you? I don't know. So
oh my gosh, this was so amazing.
It was so fun. I'm so glad.
I feel like I learned so much, and I think my listeners are really gonna enjoy this. So I'm happy. And I want to say just thank you for doing what you do.
Oh, thank you.
It matters. I mean, you've seen how much it matters. And we just need more people like you who are dedicated because,
you as well. Speech pathology is absolutely
necessary.
So good for you. Good for you. That's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, hopefully we can do this again.
Yes.
Because I'm always coming up with questions. And thank you for doing this again.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to meet you, and bother me anytime.
Okay. And send me the email with all this stuff.
I will.
Yes. All right. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. So did you like the interview, Anthony?
Yes, I did.
Yes.
I'm glad. I love the question about asking who's your favorite serial killer, because it's like one of those things that I think everyone, well, I don't say everyone because I
don't have a favorite serial killer.
You're not as experienced with like serial killers and things like this.
No, and you can tell like with the questions I was asking her, I was like, so what about this and what about that?
But myself growing up, I knew about all these people, and I was kind of fascinated by these people. Like one of my favorite movies is Silence of the Lambs.
Oh God, no, I can't.
Top 5 favorite. I used to watch that with my mom as a kid.
I love that movie. Twisted.
Yeah, so like all these type of people, like Ted Bundy's, Richard Ramirez,
right.
Charles Manson's, and like all these people, Jeffrey Dahmer. Yeah. I've grown up knowing about all these people, especially a lot of them got arrested like early 90s.
Yeah.
So it was just dope to hear someone say like, oh, she studies them, but she's fascinated. I don't say it's her favorite, but like she's fascinated by that case.
Yeah, and we need people who are brave enough to do that, because I couldn't fucking do that. Mm-hmm. Like I couldn't work with people who have like eaten people and like, no, come on. I don't even know how the fuck I would do that. So I actually told her that too. I'm like, yo, what you do is amazing. She actually helps a lot of people even like get out of those like really bad like habits and lead normal lives. So I think that that's amazing. But I really liked what she highlighted about like the positives of the inmates. Like not all of, like, you know, the way the media portrays them is like they're animals. You don't deserve to like live normal lives. They need to be treated like they're animals. And the way that she highlighted like how loyal they can be, how respectful they can be, how they hold you down. They held her down. And I just thought that was really dope. It would be cool to have a show. I told her she should start a show. Like highlighting the positives of like the prison system and the inmates.
And you'll be surprised, because I went to prisons a lot growing up.
Yeah.
they're big on respect.
Yeah.
In prisons, they're really big on respect. They have more respect a lot of times than people out here.
Which is crazy.
Like it's different. It's a whole different world. Everything is based off of respect. You don't disrespect people there.
Yeah. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the interview, and we will see you next week. Right? Yes. Okay. Bye, guys.
Peace.